Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am Elisa. I am head of marketing at Bridgin, and I'm here just to give you some quick information on this live interview and how you can ask questions to our speakers. This event is organized by Bridgin, Invest Lisboa, and the British Portuguese Chamber of Commerce. And our speakers today are John Graham-Cumming, CTO of Cloudflare, and Rosa Jimenez Cano, experienced journalist and Silicon Valley expert. With John and Rosa today, we're going to cover a few hot topics, such as the US elections results, Brexit, and the rise of Lisbon as an internationally recognized innovation hub. You will see at the bottom of the page, there is a little icon in the shape of a speaking cloud. That is where you can ask your questions to the speakers, and Rosa will be taking them in the course of the interview. That is all from my side. So Rosa and John, I leave the lead to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you, Elisa. Good morning. Well, this is from the US. Good morning. This good afternoon in Lisbon and Europe. Thank you, John, for joining us and talking about these hot topics. Usually tech executives try to avoid this kind of situation, so more points for you. And I would like to start about talking about what just happened a week ago, that we have a president in the US, where I'm based, that is refusing to accept the results, or supposed to be results. Now I don't know what's fake news and what's real news and what are facts and things like that. After 4 years of this president, everything looks very different from what the US used to be. And I think this is a very different situation for everybody, not just citizens, but also for tech executives and anybody that has a company based in the US. So what's your point with this new situation, and what do you expect, not from a political side, but also a practical business person side?
Well, I think from the practical side, there's just a general acceptance around the world, apart from a few people, that Biden has been elected and Kamala Harris as a vice president. And so what's happening, I think, from a business perspective, is that businesses are thinking about what a Biden presidency will look like, how things might change, on the assumption that, you know, he becomes president. And if in the very unlikely case that Trump remains president, well, we already know what the Trump presidency is like. So it's really just a sort of contingency planning of saying, okay, well, looks like it's a Biden-Harris administration. What difference does that make? And then planning from there.
Very good. I think there's an interesting point that I want to touch is Kamala Harris. She's a very well-known person in Silicon Valley. She was the general attorney for California. Mm-hmm. And he made a law that could somehow refer to what we consider the GDPR in Europe. She made mm-hmm. the same in California. So do you think she will have an interesting role for tech once she's the vice president?
Well, I think it's interesting you bring up GDPR as an important piece of legislation, and because I think what's going to happen in 2021, actually regardless of what happens in the US presidency, is that consumer and individual privacy and data sovereignty in different countries are going to really come to the fore. And so, you know, whether Kamala Harris, you know, becomes the vice president and then something like GDPR gets introduced across the US, GDPR is just a reality. And many firms like Cloudflare just decided the easiest thing was just to apply it globally and just say, look, we'll behave. This is how we deal with things. And it shows really the power of Europe to change how people think about their rights, for example. So regardless of what happens, I think the story of the internet in 2021 is going to be about individual privacy and about states and regions making laws about where their citizens' data can be processed and end up.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I remember at some point, Mr. Zuckerberg saying that he wished he had not literally something similar to GDPR for the rest of the world, that at some point he's always found guilty of doing things, but those things are not really like literally forbidden, but there's not a clear framework.
Right.
So starting using GDPR could be a way to start building and have a consensus in all the tech industry to have like a law that could be used.
Well, I mean, the good thing about GDPR from the tech industry perspective, or one of the good things, is that it is well understood at this point, right? It's been a law for a long time. It's been in practice in law for a long time. And so I think it's well understood by tech companies around the world that operate in Europe. So in some ways that makes it easy to implement the versions of GDPR. You know, if some country were to adopt their sort of twist on it, it makes it fairly easy to do that. Whether there'll be actually a sort of a single overriding kind of international consensus on what this looks like, I think is a different question, because you see countries like, you know, Brazil or India or Russia, and then the EU as a whole, talking a lot about data sovereignty and privacy. And so there will be different takes on this around the world. And I guess a question will be whether the US remains a little bit perhaps isolated in the sense of having that slightly more, in their sense, free way of dealing with private data, right? Which is slightly looser than, say, the European model. But this is coming, no doubt about it. The things like GDPR and around data sovereignty are going to be the reality of the internet in the next year or two.
Okay, so this idea of the new president or the change in the US takes me to something that Mr. Trump has been very close to, which is the Brexit. So now there's some kind of uncertainty around it. Well, there's a big impact in import and export and the financial sector. This is also to expand internally somehow. So if you had a tech startup, what would you do? Like going to London, going to continental Europe? How do you think this change is going to impact Europe?
So, I mean, the effects of Brexit have been felt for a long time. You know, why am I speaking to you from Lisbon and not London? I was the first employee of Cloudflare outside of the US in London and helped build that office up to about 300 people. Because of Brexit, and also partly because of Cloudflare's very rapid growth, we needed to have another location in continental Europe somewhere, and we ended up being in Lisbon. And we can talk a little bit about why it was Lisbon. But so those effects have been real for a long time. In fact, very quickly after the referendum, before any laws were changed, we saw a change in, you know, people's attitudes towards working in London or elsewhere, with many Europeans saying, I'd love to work for Cloudflare, but not in London. So that effect has been around. Now we're kind of in the end game where the actual rules are coming into play. And of course, there's still some uncertainty about what will happen post the withdrawal agreement. Will there be an agreement with the EU? And what will it look like? And it's that uncertainty again, just like in 2016, which creates difficulties for business. So when you think about the connection with the US election as well, it's like it's all about uncertainty. Or, you know, businesses love certainty. They love to know what the rules are. They love to know where things are going. And so we're dealing with uncertainty. And now, so if you ask the question about a startup, you should do the startup where you have the team of people who are going to work on it. So startups are really hard. I've worked for a number, and Cloudflare is the one that you all know the name of, and the rest of them you don't know the name of, because they're really, really hard to do. So I would start with knowing where your core team is. Now, the question is whether you would uproot your core team and move it to another country is a much harder question. And that would really, you then need to start thinking about what's the availability of talent in that location. What's the availability, or, you know, from an immigration perspective, is it easy to bring people in if you're going to do that? Especially because startups tend to be fairly diverse groups of people. And lastly, what access do you have to money? So in terms of, you know, fundraising. And obviously, you know, if you look back over the last, say, 10 years, London has been a big center for that. Berlin has, Paris has. I mean, Paris, obviously, a lot of startups around Paris. And to a certain extent, Lisbon too. And, you know, you can find pockets of startups all over the place. But I think that the core thing is, where is your team that's going to bootstrap this thing? Because that initial period is really the critical thing before you're worrying about what your market looks like, before you're worrying about your actual product being out there.
Good. And so this takes me to why Lisbon? Why Cloudflare has a CTO in Lisbon, which is a very executive and lead position? Well,
I mean, first of all, I love living in Lisbon because it's absolutely a beautiful place to live, right? So I came from London, where every day is pretty much gray, and you can't see, but I can see out the window here the blue sky in Lisbon. And it seems a bit silly to say that, but I lived in Silicon Valley, and you know, you will have this experience, which is that there is an important thing, which is optimism. And you get optimism in part from the weather, right? You get this, you get up every day and you know you're not going to fight the weather. And so I think, you know, that was a little taster for me of what Lisbon would be like. And I think a couple of things happened that made Lisbon really work for Cloudflare. So we did a big search process. We looked at countries from essentially from Estonia to Iceland. So we actually ended up looking at 45 cities where we could possibly put our engineering office. And bear in mind, this is very much an engineering office. You know, we were talking earlier about Paris, and we have an office in Paris and an office in Munich, which are focused around our customers, customer support, sales, all those sorts of things. But we wanted an engineering, technical, security, operations office. And so, you know, we were looking for a number of characteristics. So there needed to be talented local people, so coming out of, you know, good universities. There needed to be a bit of an ecosystem of other companies who have been training, you know, people getting experience in those locations. We wanted it to be somewhere people would actually want to move. So there are many cities in Europe which are, you know, let's say very cheap, but not necessarily the case that they attract people who want to naturally move there. And Lisbon is a very attractive place to live. Lisbon is low cost and high standard of living, right? So it's not an expensive place to live, and the style of living is good. So when you're talking about a battle for talent, particularly at the technical level, you want to think about those aspects as well. Like, is the person going to be happy living here? And then there were other things that made Lisbon attractive. I mean, from a political perspective, the country is very welcoming to immigrants, and from a personal perspective, right, on the street every day. And that makes a big difference because you're inevitably going to end up with a mixture of people. Cloudflare has gone from 12 people when we started it just over a year ago to 63 people in Lisbon. And it's a real mixture of local people hired here and people brought into the country. So you want that immigration policy to be very, very attractive. And Lisbon actually had another thing which seems silly, but the time zone. So the time zone here is the same as in UK and Ireland. And that keeps us 8 hours from San Francisco. And that actually turns out to be a really big deal. I mean, Barcelona is a really lovely place. And people often say, why didn't you go to Barcelona? Well, let's think about that. Politically, there was some instability when we were making the choice about the location. So that was difficult. And also, you're talking 1 hour later, and it seems silly. What difference does 1 hour make? Well, it makes a big difference when you're trying to overlap work days. When you go from 8 hours to 9 hours of difference, you really narrow the gap when you're trying to work with other offices. So all these things, right? The standard of living, political policies around immigration, the public feeling towards immigrants in the country, the fact that it was a good location at a low cost with a high standard of living, all these things came together to say, you know what, Lisbon is where we would have the office. And why did I move? I'd been in London for 10 years. I'd lived in other places around the world. And it was a chance to do a couple of things. One is go and experience another country and culture and learn another language. But the other one was bootstrap something. You know, I'd bootstrapped the London office from 0 or 1, me, to 300. And now we're bootstrapping again. And that's always a really exciting phase, is to build something new.
Good. But I think you've touched some very important points related to the pool of talent you found in Lisbon and how it attracts. So I think those are key points to build an ecosystem. In the time you've been in Lisbon, how have you seen it change, and how do you feel how mature it is right now?
So it's hard for me to say in a year and 3 months that I've really seen a big change, right? So my experience in Portugal is limited to a short history. So I always joke that I'm the only British person who'd never been to the Algarve before I actually moved to Lisbon, because I'd never been to Portugal. Although I'd been to Portugal for technical reasons. So I, about 5 or 6 years ago, came and spoke at a conference here and called Sapo Code Bits. And what I was really struck by was this just feeling of all of those engineers and technical people in one place in the Parque de Nações. And I was like, okay, wait, there's really something going on here. And then Web Summit moved here, and it really helped get those things going. So it's hard for me to say in a year and a bit what's changed here. What I have really discovered, we had this as sort of part of our thesis for coming to Lisbon, was that there was a sort of almost missing generation of people who were Portuguese, who got a very good education here, and then left Portugal, essentially for economic reasons, and went to London or Berlin or Paris. And got a great experience in startups and technology companies and things like that, and really wanted to come back to Portugal. And the Portuguese government has an incentive for them to return. And that made it feel like, actually, you know what, there's this amazing combination of people who are here with a good education and have been through a lot of things, particularly people who've been in, say, telecommunications. They've had a lot of experience. And this pool of Portuguese outside of Portugal who'd really like to return home and have got this incredible experience in those major sort of startup locations. So that really was part of our thesis, and actually it turned out to be true. About 10% of the people we have in Cloudflare in Lisbon are actually returning Portuguese people.
Oh, that's super interesting. I have a question related to this from the audience, from Miguel Rodriguez, and he's talking about the weather, the optimism, all the topics we've been touching, but also I think it's something that is now kind of fashion, which is the digital nomads. So how can you transform that trend that there are people like touching places and testing where to stay, and because they like that kind of lifestyle, but at some point they look for long-term living. Mm-hmm. So do you find that in Lisbon, those digital nomads are willing to stay, or you can attract them from that perspective?
So to be honest with you, I don't think Cloudflare employs many people who would call themselves a digital nomad, right? We're a hardcore engineering company building products. Our employees tend to have long lifetime with the company, you know, many, many years. And so we're not tending to move sort of people around. That's certainly true in some other industries like marketing and digital, you know, some of these digital industries where you see that. But I do agree that Lisbon is a location where I've spoken to many people who are foreigners who have come here not with a 1 or 2 year outlook. They've come here with a longer outlook where they feel like this is a place, you know, I can live, enjoy the life here. My children could go to school if they have, you know, kids, lots of schooling, and feel, you know, set some roots here. And from my personal experience, it really felt very quickly like it was home, and it was, you know, somewhere I wanted to stay.
Good. Following this conversation, Jay Umaretilla is telling us that how do you find the talent, or how do you measure the ability of trained people before setting your software company? How do you have a kind of a radar or a way to measure that when you feel that the talent is moving out? How do you do it to have a way to find those talents and make the decision?
So one thing we did as part of this big search, where we looked at the, you know, the 45 different cities around Europe, was once we narrowed it down to a small number, we were able to talk to 2 groups of people. So we talked to the investment agencies within those countries. And so in Portugal, there's an agency called ICEP, which is very, very well organized and very professional, and can give you information about these kind of questions about, you know, movement of people and movement of, you know, capital and things like that. And they're very, very helpful for doing that. So we were able to get that information. And then the EU actually publishes a lot of statistics about movement within the EU. So you can start to understand where are people moving to, where are they going. And then actually there's a firm in London called Atomico, which is a VC firm, and they actually have a state of the EU tech report they put out every year. That was also a very useful piece of information. But, you know, the bigger reality is that in some ways, those things are trailing indicators. There are people who've already moved there. You know, what we wanted to do was say, actually, I think Lisbon is going to go like this. There's like a real, and Portugal in general, right? We're in Lisbon. Obviously, there's a big community around Porto as well. But Portugal in general has a lot of good things going that can cause it to take off. When you're in a startup, you want to be on that upward curve. So we looked at all that data, and then we plumped for Portugal.
Yeah, I wanted to make a joke. I think that report is one of those things that Atomico is not copycatting, right? It's like on themselves. But I'm saying that, it's not you. Just kidding. So we have Francisco Castelo Branco saying that, do you think, or do you guess it's possible to convert London into the main technological hub in Europe? Or Lisbon? Do you see Lisbon as a future, let's say, tech beacon for the region?
So I think that, you know, it's unlikely that Lisbon becomes the #1 location in Europe. right? Because London, Paris, and Berlin have got a bit of a head start. And particularly London, there's a lot of venture capital there and things going on. But what you see with technology is it can change very, very rapidly. And so I think what can happen in Lisbon is you can get this very rapid increase in the number of startups, and you only have to sort of get a couple of successes and then things get moving. And so you have to look at it and say, is there another location in Europe which is likely to move as fast as Lisbon? And I don't think so. I think Lisbon has got a lot going for it and can really grow rapidly, in Portugal in general, actually, but in particular in the Lisbon area. So will it ever become the number one? Hard for me to imagine that it would. But on the other hand, for example, for Cloudflare, it's our second largest European office. It will likely remain that way and might eclipse London at some point. So, there are real things happening here.
Yeah, and I think a sign of how much you're betting on Lisbon is that you are there. Like the CTO is kind of the top 5 management in a company that is public traded.
Yes.
So not just some makeup, it's a real fact.
Yeah, so no, it's not, we didn't come here to build a call center that supports the Portuguese language or something like that. We said, at the time when we were thinking about moving, into Europe somewhere out of London, we had about 50% of the engineering was done in London, about 50% was done in the US. That was already unusual, right? Many technology companies, it's really all in the US and the rest is sales. Because we had that mix, then when we look at Lisbon, it's like, no, this is engineering, right? We're going to build product here, and we started shipping stuff out of Lisbon, and we have our security team here, and we have our technical support team here as well. And by the way, our head of European support moved with me to Lisbon. So it's like, this is not an outpost. This is, our second and maybe one day largest office in Europe.
Good. We have a question from Paulo Frazao, asking if you have any plans to hire sales staff in Lisbon, such as sales or solution engineers.
So when we initially came here, it was really me, the head of technical support, and a small group of people from England and from the US who seeded the office here. And the company was really thinking, this is going to be a technology office. I'm going to be here. It's going to be all technology people, security team, operations, network operations, all that kind of stuff. What happened really fast is that the company realized that there was a broader talent pool in Lisbon and they could start recruiting into it. So very quickly, we hired HR, we hired finance people, accountants, so the administrative parts of the business started to grow. So actually, not very well known, but quite a significant bit of Cloudflare's financial stuff is done in Lisbon because, once again, there are people with good backgrounds, good degrees, good experience here, and some who returned who could help with that. The department that hadn't yet hired in Lisbon was the sales department, and they are actually going to start in January hiring here as well, because we think that we can cover, well, first of all, obviously Iberia from here as well, but to a certain extent we can assist with Brazil because of the language, and some parts of North Africa probably. So we'll hire for those roles here as well. So what will happen, and this is one of the reasons why I'm very positive about Cloudflare in Portugal, is that that's a mirror of what happened in London. London was super technical. It was just me, bunch of nerds. And then we grew and grew and grew and grew, and we grew out everything else. And so the same thing is happening here in Lisbon. And we've gone from, let's say, 12 to 63 in 14 months, and we're just keeping going.
Good, super interesting. We are talking about talent. Do you feel, Joel Tomé is asking us, do you feel there's not now too much competition for talent in Portugal, or it's just a matter of demand and offer problem?
So I don't think there's too much demand. And you can really see this in that there hasn't been like spiraling salary stuff. I mean, one of the things that Cloudflare has done is actually reduced our dependence on San Francisco, because there's a like crazy war for talent where people are being paid like, like they're NBA stars or something just because they can type on a keyboard. That I don't think it's happened yet in Lisbon. And I think that the pandemic, you saw a number of companies laying people off, getting into difficulties with the pandemic. So actually, if that was happening, it got slowed down by COVID. So no, I don't think there's a big thing. And I do think that the people returning to Portugal is going to be a big a big thing for the country. And, you know, hopefully in a few years' time, maybe there will be a war for talent in Portugal, but not yet.
Yeah, that's just exactly what Pedro Barbosa was asking us, like if there's going to be more like talent easy moves. So one thing is I would like to ask you is how do you nurture talent? In an ecosystem, there are different like key roles, and one is getting like high level or a big pool of talent. I'm now based in Miami. I came here 2 years ago after 5 years in San Francisco. And here there are challenges that are in that way. How do you find a good CTO or a good CFO or product managers that are like really CPOs or experienced? So far I've seen two options. One is making them come and making them see that they can make a big impact and inspire some other people and build something different. But on the other hand, we also need people, make them grow in the ecosystem. So how do you balance that in order to make Lisbon the beacon we are saying?
Well, I think that, you know, it's interesting what you said, which is like, how do you find a CTO or something like that? And I actually think that that's a terrible question to ask, because one of the problems companies have is they'll decide, you know, okay, well, I need to hire a CTO, or I need to hire this, or I need to hire that. And maybe you do need those things, right? But I'll give you a story from the beginning of Cloudflare. At the beginning of Cloudflare, there was only one person with a job title, and that was Matthew Prince, who's the CEO, because somebody needed to be the CEO, right? Michelle, who's the other co-founder, her title, which we just made up, was head of user experience, which meant, you know, I'm going to care about how our users experience our product. And so I think there's a tendency to sort of try and mimic and almost like, you know, children dressing up in, you know, like princesses, dress up as, I'm the CTO. And the problem with that is that you end up sort of hemming yourself in. What if that person turns out actually not to be the great CTO, but to be something else? And one of the interesting things that happened at Cloudflare was Lee Holloway, who was the technical founder of Cloudflare. He very explicitly was like, I'm not the right person to do that. I don't want that job title. I'm not the right person to manage it. So don't hem yourself in at the beginning with giving everybody fancy titles. Figure out, okay, what is it I'm doing? And then what am I building? Okay, and then we'll take it from there. So I think, first of all, don't decide you need a CTO. Then when you think about nurturing talent, like if you look at, you know, here in Lisbon, really the universities have a big role to play in educating people. And then companies have a role in, you know, exposing those people to really interesting, hard problems. And I think that's what, when you look at a company like Cloudflare, you know, we're not outsourcing something that's not, you know, that maybe is an important application for a bank somewhere, but isn't actually super technically hard. You know, what makes people succeed is work on some hard problem and solve it. And so, you know, what I would say to anyone who's building a startup in Lisbon or in Porto or anywhere else in Portugal is, it is much easier to work on something hard in a way than it is to work on something easy. And the reason I say that is you can spend almost as much effort doing something easy as doing something hard. So do the hard thing because you'll learn much more. So do something really ambitious. Don't be like, we'll do the Portuguese version of Deliveroo. Like, okay, great, but that's not technically hard. Do something that's difficult. You know, some machine learning thing. You know, the universities here are great at machine learning. Do something which is technically tough, and then people will grow.
So create a big challenge to attract great talent too.
Yeah,
right?
if you're starting a company, make it something worthwhile. Don't make it like a knockoff of something else.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I have two questions from CM and NMM that are more or less very similar, which is related to Portuguese engineering. How do you rank it? And if you've tried to look at some other places like Braga, Porto, Aveiro, like different places that are not directly Lisbon, but that also have an interesting pool of talent.
So one of the first things I learned coming to Portugal was that when I said that we had chosen to open an office in Lisbon, there was a large group of people who said, why isn't it in Porto? And I hadn't actually understood that there was this incredible rivalry between Porto and Lisbon. But the thing is, the reason that rivalry is there in part is because there are very, very good pools of talent in both locations. Right? And so we chose to be in Lisbon. And obviously we have people who have moved from other parts of Portugal to be here. But It exists. Yeah, I agree with you. Aveiro, Porto, Lisbon. I mean, there are good engineering universities, a good experience coming from people. So I think that for us, we chose to be in Lisbon. Will we at some point need an engineering office in Porto or Aveiro? Maybe. For the moment, 60 people, we're still fairly small here.
Good. I would like to move a little bit the conversation around also like the legal framework. There was a brief question about how long it takes until you can make a move or something in Europe or specifically in Lisbon. How do you deal with bureaucracy, and do you think it's changing or it's still too slow and that could be a stopper?
So it's really hard for me to say if it's changing, having been here a year and 2 months or something like that. In terms of, for anybody who's part of, the EU, moving here is simple, right? I mean, I still am part of the EU. I think Brexit hasn't quite happened yet. Yeah, that was an easy process. I moved here. I went and registered at the city, the town hall, and that was the process. So the EU side of things is very, very simple. And actually setting up the company, what I would say to anybody is, if you're coming from outside of Portugal, Portuguese lawyers, don't try and work with some international law firm that's outside of Portugal. Come here, find a local firm, work with them. They know what will need to be done to get things set up. It was relatively easy. I think it took us a few weeks to get ourselves legally created as a company here. I think the area where we've seen some friction has been on visas for people coming out from outside of Portugal. So a small number of our staff in Portugal came from other places, Brazil, the US, other locations like that. And that's probably been the area where we've had the most difficulty. And I think perhaps where there's the most, there's a big ambition on the part of the government with a thing called the tech visa to make that easy to bring people in. And I think that hasn't been totally realized. And that's probably the most bureaucratic area we've had to deal with.
Yeah, I remember at some point when I was in Silicon Valley that Mexico, they created kind of a tech visa for people that were, when Trump came and made some change on the visas, some people with the H-1Bs and things like that had to move. So going to Jalisco was kind of an easy choice, same time zone and something we were saying. So I think that could be a good example to attract talent. Yeah. And make a lot of sense. But on the other hand, you have a big pool of people to hire that has a UE passport. So yes, there's some kind of a balance, I guess.
Completely. I mean, you've got, we're talking here about non-EU people. So, for anyone who's EU, very simple, right? And then for anyone who's Portuguese, even simpler, right? So, this is not, I think that it has, some of the bureaucratic problems slowed us down in hiring some of the people we wanted to bring in from outside of Europe, but has not slowed us down for anything that was EU related.
Good. Sofia Robalo has a couple of questions. Both are related to your offices. So is it opening in Lisbon connected to the Brexit somehow? And she wonders about your strategy of having different hubs or places, kind of a distributed model. How does it work in your company?
Okay, so yeah, I mean, opening in Lisbon was definitely, there were two factors. One was Brexit, because we saw EU citizens, Portuguese, Spanish, French, Italian saying, yeah, I'd love to work for you, but not in London because of the uncertainty. That started first with people who had families because there was uncertainty about their family situation, and then it really extended into even individuals who might have come alone. So Brexit was one part, and also Cloudflare is growing very, very fast. And so, finding talent there is a battle for talent in London, and finding good people here is in some ways a little bit easier. So those two factors were really important. In terms of the strategy for us, in terms of different locations around the world, I think there's a few different factors to consider. So Cloudflare is truly a global business. More than 50% of our revenue is from outside of the US. So we need sales offices around the world. So, very early on, we opened an office in Singapore, and obviously we had the office in London, and then we had offices in other locations, because you need to service people in their local language, in their local culture, in those locations. So those kind of offices will open up more rapidly than the engineering style offices. So we just opened an office in Paris, which is very focused on that sales and support kind of side of things. We also have to do operations, right? We're managing a global network, 200 cities around the world, fiber optic links between them. It's an enormous network. So you need to have operations people in different time zones. So that was another thing that led to different offices around the world. And then the engineering thing happened organically. Because I was in London, I got hired into the company when it was 24 people. I built an engineering organization around me in London, and Cloudflare saw the benefit of having these different locations. So, you get a couple of things. You get engineering work going on 24 hours a day, right? Because there's somebody working on something in different locations. You get people with different experiences. And I do think something very significant happened for Cloudflare, which is that in London, and I hope this turns out to be true in Lisbon, people stay with the company for a long time. The people in Silicon Valley, they have an enormous opportunity and also an enormous kind of shiny object, mentality. Oh, everything's moved to Bitcoin now. I'm going to go to work for a Bitcoin company. Or everything's moved to machine learning. I'm going to work for a machine learning company. I think a factor of, and maybe it's a factor of sort of old Europe, as the Americans like to say, is we might be a little bit more reticent to move to a different company. And so what that means is you build deep knowledge in the organization. There are colleagues I've worked with for 5-7 years, right? They understand our technology, our customers in a way that somebody who works at a company for 2 years really, they lose that knowledge after 2 years. So you get different, just as you get different cultures in different countries, you get different sort of aspects to the company. So one of them is, you get to hire in a different pool of people. You get people who I think in Europe have generally stayed with us a bit longer than in, say, San Francisco. And you get operations happening worldwide, engineering happening worldwide. The downside is you have to manage it. And I know that in the beginning we made a complete mess of it. We had people who were managed by a manager who was on the other side of the world, and it was very, very difficult. And we had to sit down and really figure out how the management was going to go. And in fact, one of the things we did in Lisbon when we came here was quite quickly hired somebody to run the engineering here who's local, who's Portuguese, because we knew that we'd made that mistake in the past of having sort of remote management around the world.
Yeah, I think the good news is that now with the pandemic, everybody's getting used to remote. So there are more guidelines and ways and some kind of good and bad experiences. So we are all learning at the same time. You were somehow experimenting it before, but right now we are on the same boat. So I think it's more not that different thing. Right.
Well, I mean, the nice thing so there's lots of bad things about the situation where everyone's working from home. Look at me talking to you from home. But one of the nice things, at least for me personally, is that the team I'm on, which is, if you think of it as the executive management team of Cloudflare, was quite heavily biased towards the US. And I used to have these video calls where I was the one on video and everyone else was sitting around a table. All of a sudden everyone's on Zoom. And suddenly it's like a level playing field. And I think that's happened for a lot of people. Suddenly you get, everyone's in the same experience. They're having the same experience. So that's definitely got easier. I don't think Cloudflare was a great remote company. We were very focused on people going into offices, and I really miss going into the office. We have a lovely office here in Lisbon, which I think I've been into twice since the pandemic. And I miss that interaction with other people. So although we have got used to it, and we've proven our flexibility as a species to adapt to this weird environment, I do look forward to the day when I can go back and actually speak to other humans in person and have those serendipitous conversations where, oh, that's a good idea, let's do that. It's very hard to schedule those random moments where you come up with a great idea.
Yeah, if I tried the remote happy hours, but I'm not sure if it's a good idea. Next day when I woke up, I was like a little bit depressed with a hangover, but what the hell I did, I just got dragged home alone, just watching the computer. So it's like very strange. We try our best to replicate the experiences, but the results somehow are not what I expected. So I'm being very aware of the things we can replicate and not. Before we leave, I'm trying to maximize the questions, but there's one very interesting and a little bit different from Paulo Frazao, which is related to something that I think is still a challenge in Europe on the tech world and the startup is how do you solve the problem or the challenge with the stock options or the RSU, which is something that usually attracts talent, but in Europe is still kind of a penalty of our friction point because it's taxed And so what was supposed to be used to attract you is something that would be like, no, give me the money, even if I know it's not good for me. So how is Cloudflare solving that? Or how do you think we can make some changes, even in, I mean, Brussels level, not just Lisbon or Madrid or like Munich?
Well, I mean, I think this varies a bit from country to country, how stock options are taxed, right? And obviously stock options are an important tool that startups use. And you mentioned specifically RSUs as well, which are a way of giving people stock. And they tend to be taxed as salary. They tend to be, in general, they tend to be taxed as if you were just being given cash. So I think that that's definitely a difference if you've been in the US with the way those are taxed. However, it's quite interesting because the US has this concept of alternative minimum tax, which is essentially if it looks like you might have not paid enough tax because there was some clever way of not paying it, then you need to pay it anyway. So sort of they have this way of kind of fixing the tax system, and so that often traps people. So my experience is, yeah, the US is somewhat lower taxation, although California is very high taxation in California. I don't think this is actually as bad as people might make it out to be in Europe. I think that, especially if you're going into a company because of money, especially a startup, then you need to step back. Successful startups tend to take 10 years and are really hard work. And if you focus on, I'm going to be Mark Zuckerberg, and if you've watched the movie, right, Social Network, it only took about 90 minutes to go from being a student at Harvard to being a billionaire. The reality is it takes a hell of a long time to be anything successful at all. And I mean, and successful being a working company, let alone being somebody like Zuckerberg. So yeah, maybe, but this has not been a thing where I think we found that was a focus for us, was to fix, try and fix tax law in Europe. I think building something real is the important thing.
Okay, I'm going to do a kind of a last double question because are two different ones from Marco Silva and CM, but similar is what has been your learnings about Lisbon ecosystem so far? And what piece of advice could you give to companies wondering if they should move to London from an engineering point of view or not?
To London? Yeah?
Lisbon.
No, to Lisbon. Okay. So I think perhaps I spoke earlier about the fact that there's this sort of missing group of people who have left Portugal and gone and done things elsewhere. I think there are some areas where there's less talent maybe in Portugal than we see elsewhere. So product management, and it's just a function of the fact that you haven't had so many successful startups who've seen product managers and build products. So I think product management is probably a thing that's kind of missing here, and you have to think about that. So that's probably one surprise. I think we kind of knew there were lots of people outside Portugal, it's real, and bringing them home is real. So you have to go to make that effort. I think if you're going to come to Lisbon, start a company here, go and do what I did, which is I went and talked to other entrepreneurs who built companies here, and really understand the situation in the country. What are the challenges? What are the great things about it? But I would highly recommend it. We have been very happy having opened this office here, and we're here for a long time. And I think Matthew gave an interview with the press the other day saying, he could easily imagine us having 1,000 people in Portugal. And I think that's the reality as we grow. So, I would say, come, talk to ICEP, talk to the mayor's office if you're going to be in a particular city. You'll get a good welcome from people, and talk to other entrepreneurs who can tell you about, the sort of real on the ground, good and bads of being here. But I'm very bullish on Portugal, and obviously I live in Lisbon, so I'm going to be bullish on Lisbon. But I think it's a great country, and I think it has such a strong ethic that it can really grow enormously.
I think that's a great message, and it's something we cannot say everywhere. So it's a very strong message about the future, and also a key word that would be trust, how to build trust that start with being that kind of honesty. Yeah. So I think it's a good final idea or final message for the audience. I hope that after we have a new elected president in the US, like everything is going to be clear in the world. And this week it's been somehow a good news week with also the vaccine and some good like discoveries, and everything about COVID is getting somehow better. So 2021, I think it's going to be the stop of this nightmare we've been living and adapting to, which is also a good, it's something that's going to be there in our lives. We're going to talk about 2020 in a very medical and challenging way, and lots of learning from here. So I would like to stop here saying thank you for your time, John, for your talent, for being so open to share. Also to Elisa and Pedro for organizing this and make this great experience. And to the audience, thanks for your time. And please keep posted, follow Bridging Portugal in Twitter for any other events coming that for sure are gonna come. And if you need anything from me or from John, we are both on Twitter, and I think both we are quite open to share our experiences, and that would be all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Muito obrigado. Boa tarde.